there's a pile of people here, books coming out, Podrick and Phil, but yourself, you've got Psychocinema. So I thought, tell us a little bit about. Me and Helen will be chatting about the themes of Psychocinema.
Okay.
So
I guess I'm one of these people who's got like strong opinions, but then also I'm a real people pleaser, so I get nervous about sharing my strong opinions in the public. But basically, it's a book that re-examines the connection between psychoanalysis and cinema, because film theory has a strong nominal relationship with psychoanalysis, which is to do with exploring the aesthetics and maybe the underlying themes and all this kind of stuff. I actually think, whilst this is an interesting theory, this is the theory that's dominated since like the 1970s, I actually think that there's a slight misdirection in it, the way it read Lacan. And so Lacan became this really strong sort of presence, quote unquote, in film theory, but I would say it's not quite Lacanian, and maybe I'll explain why. And I think it's sort of high time that we re-examine this connection. And basically the main idea is that film psychoanalytic theory doesn't help us elucidate, what's going on in the director's head or what something represents, but film can act as psychoanalysis on the subject. So that's the kind of like main claim. I think basically what happened was, and this
Can I say something about what I think you mean by that? In that instance of what Helen's doing is what psychoanalysis does, correct me if I'm wrong here, but psychoanalysis in a sense confronts you with your desire, with your enjoyment. So sometimes you're getting enjoyment out of something, you don't realize you're getting enjoyment out of it, and this is called the gaze in psychoanalysis, where sometimes you see some objective thing happening to you, like a set of relationships that are always chaotic. There's always drama around you. Oh God, why is there always drama around me? And then maybe briefly in analysis you notice, oh, I'm kind of causing that drama. There's something about, I'm poking people without even knowing it. I'm enjoying the drama. I think I'm a passive recipient of it, but I'm actually an active part of this and I'm getting something out of it. And in the same way, cinema can not just express a kind of satisfaction of your desire in a phantasmic form, but you're saying that cinema at its most emancipatory can confront the viewer with their desire.
So basically that's maybe a structure of cinema that we can maybe reflect on coming out of this idea, which is that perhaps politically, if we take it like to its political kind of end, film could actively confront us with our desire and maybe help us relate to it. And I think the technology of film does this in a particular way that I go into in the film. But there's lots of different ways. Like you can have film that's not particularly intellectual or like politically interesting, but if it's read in a certain way, it can teach us something about the way we desire, and we can relate to it and examine our relationship to it in terms of the way we're satisfied by completion, all this kind of stuff. Basically, like I would kind of think that critical theory, I'm really pro, but there was a sort of way that it's been tied to a version of psychoanalysis.
This is her people pleasing, by the way. She's scared to say that she doesn't really like a lot of critical theory, so I'm kind of pro this. Anyway, so keep going.
Anyway, so basically, and you mentioned the word gaze, right? Because I'm sure we've all heard of this idea, male gaze, in film theory. And whilst male gaze as an idea on its own could be a good idea, as in it's looking at the way that desire that is sexuated, quote unquote male, or gendered male, has an ambition towards closure and sort of does not recognise its own lack. This is a description of a form of desire that some people, men and women and all kinds of people, not just men, can possess, and we can problematise it. The trouble is that what happened is there was a sort of like use of psychoanalysis as if it's like in a sort of scientistic way. So ideologically, humans like to kind of think like a detective in a detective show, where there's some like truth hidden from us. That basically, the world's really difficult and shit, but actually there's a possible world where it's all good and we just need the right information. So as long as I can understand my subjectivity the right way, then I'm going to find something out. And this sort of scientistic approach, which I think is a fundamental misreading of Lacan, basically uses Lacanian terminology, which sounds all kind of confusing and like a thing, and turns it into like a concrete idea and kind of locks it down as men are like this is their essence and there's nothing we can do about it. And so this also connected to like critical theory, and where I think critical theory tragically did not, transform itself and has not been, there's lots of really good work going on, but like we think about people like Foucault, for instance, who were really interestingly talking about capitalism in its manifest form like 80 years ago, and so capitalism was a dynamic, and it's a continuing dynamic, but the dynamic was a certain way at that period in the mid-century, and the manifest cultural stuff Foucault was commenting on. But so Foucault talks about gaze, but in a different way to the way film theorists talk about it. And he talks about things like medical gaze, which is to do with manifest power in given contexts. What happened is people recognized that Lacan, who is more like Sartre in his understanding of gaze, but even more radical, is using the word gaze, so it must be the same thing. And Lacan talks about male desire in a certain way. When we look at films, we're looking at the way people are looking, so let's call this gaze. And men looking this way, there's a problem with patriarchy in the mid-20th century and misogyny because of material conditions. Therefore, the conclusion is this thing looked down. In reality, the trouble is gaze is actually a universal question. So we can talk about sexuation, which is the way people are gendered, and people are gendered in certain ways according to material conditions and material reality. It's not like you are born with it. You develop it because of your second birth into subjectivity. And everybody goes through that, every gender, every race, every type of person. So it's not like gaze is like this thing and men are disgusting because they look in this way. As Lacan says, there is latent hysteria in all subjects in the entire world, which is basically there is lack in everybody. Gaze, actually, Lacan, is not gendered because it comes before sexuation, and it comes sort of over sexuation because it's to do with how, at the base of everything, every subject lacks. Yeah. And it's also not to do with seeing. Okay, so basically, ideologically, we think that seeing is like the totalizing thing. We automatically, when we say taste automatically means, discernment, which is to do with like, I'm a divided subject who can think and choose about, I have a taste for chocolate. It feels wrong, but we say in 20/20 vision, in hindsight, I saw it with my very eyes. Gaze is really not about like men who objectify women look like this and they see a stiletto or they see a woman, that's not it. Gaze is actually how the object or subject we're looking at looks back at us and exposes our own lack to ourselves. So by gendering gaze and really talking about a Foucauldian gaze, which was relevant in the mid-20th century according to the manifest cultural forms that capitalism was taking, which are different today, and we sort of arrested them by turning this into this like scientistic language, instead of seeing the openness in the terms of gaze, and how, because this is something to do with something that's more ontological than gender, it's something that actually transcends and is relevant now. Gaze is as much to do with the object or the subject object that's receiving the look as the looker.
Yes.
So you can't really gender it because it's like, does that cushion have a gender? Well, you're a man apparently and I'm a girl apparently, so the gaze is what's operating between us as a residue. It's not like, you can critique like a man is looking in this way, but in terms of actually Lacan and Lacan's contribution, his philosophical contribution, by arresting it in this way that's so concrete. And it's hard to articulate as a filmmaker how much this has affected the production of film and the things you're supposed to make and what's deemed radical, and is this people will talk about female gaze as if this is, and talk about it as Lacanian. But the trouble is, by claiming that that's Lacan's contribution to film, we've like lost a whole potential, like a philosophical, political and artistic potential to film that I think is a real tragedy.
Well, can you give, because that's a lot of theory, but very good, sorry, but can you give a cinematic example of where you think a film, maybe even a popular film, potentially confronts the audience with their desire?
Yeah, okay. I think every film does. in different ways, whether deliberately or not. The Wizard of Oz is a really clear example. So a lot of people critique Hollywood films because they're too totalizing and this is bad because it's capitalist. Capitalism has an ambition to totalize, but it never can. So that's sort of a problem. So even if you claim it is total, it just never is because we live in a non-total universe. But basically, what I would say is interesting about Hollywood film and where it can be emancipatory is it really, by its structure, by the way the story works, by the sets and the ambition, it leads us by our desire. So it sets up a subject that we can identify with, the character that we can identify with, which also shows that like there's a universal lack in everybody, because you can have Ripley in the 70s as a female, you know, character that men of 80 years old can identify with, and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, so we'll take the example of Wizard of Oz. You have this girl Dorothy at the beginning, and she is in a sense of loss. She has a sense that she needs to achieve something by the end of the film, and the whole film is directed through sound, colour, eventually music, the whole structure of the story, about the target of getting this thing, finding the Wizard of Oz. And so this really involves us and leads us by desire, and it takes us to a point of revelation where we're all like jazzed up and ready to find out what's going on, only to be revealed that behind the curtain the wizard or God is divided, and we are confronted with the fact that there is nothing there, you know. And I think that film, by setting up, and you know, even if we know that there's something lacking on the other side, we still get, you know, taken along by this drive, by this fantasy, by this desire to get there. And I think there's a way of showing us that, you know, this stuff about, you know, psychoanalysis and showing that desire is lacking and stuff is not about like not doing anything and giving up on desire. Desire is like the most important force in the universe. We have to go after things still knowing that on the other side there's nothing, and that's the real challenge. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of ways. Something like Wizard of Oz is like a really manifest way.
Yeah,
where
that's a good example, yeah.
But all films, you know, so you can talk about like how film relates to sex or orgasm, right? And they call it orgasm in French, the little death, because basically you are confronted in orgasm, really the nothingness of every, and you realise that actually the good bit is the bit that led up to it.
Yeah.
So even if you're, the ways that people have written about this a lot in terms of TV series keep you going because they never give you the closure. And as soon as you get the closure, you're like, is that it?
Yeah.
You know. So it's not just about saying we should make, you know, there are theorists in sort of the 60s and 70s that were claiming that like realism was the most important thing, and American films were bad because they weren't realistic. It's like, yeah, well, desires. The whole thing about desire is that it denies reality, you know, and that, yeah.
But yeah, I love us.
Yeah.
But do you? It's interesting that all films do this, because I kind of go like, well, no,
they don't
most films,
do it.
Yeah, but do most films that not like try to cover over the gaze?
Okay, I would say yeah, but they do. But the gaze is still there
Well,
when
still
you
there.
leave the cinema and you feel a sense of lack.
Yes.
Because you haven't been fulfilled. I would say the worst kinds of films politically are the ones that think that they're above it and are sort of just like blah-de-da, you know.
But the best kind of films are the ones that actively expose it, which is only a few.
Yeah, no, only a few. Yeah,
so
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
I like what you're saying. So you're saying like all films do it, but there's the ones that I can actively.
Yeah, there's a film that I
confront
really
you.
like, a Belgian film by the Dardenne brothers from 2014 called, is it 2014 or 2011? 2014, I think, called 2 Days, 1 Night. And I won't go into the story, but it's basically, I think, a really political film because it's about a woman who has to go on a journey and confront, basically, through her interaction with other people, the gradual loss of her desire so that she can confront depression and like actually engage in a reality that is as it is, not as she wants it to be. And this is kind of a very political thing that we have to kind of deal with. A lot of capitalism, the problems remain because we are so invested in denying the problem. Alenka Sapanchis just wrote a book about disavowal being the most, you know, important thing that we have to tarry with today. Our denial. We can see reality with our eyes, but we still don't see it. You know, and if we don't see it and aren't able to tarry with it, we can't build a future that is actually engaged with reality as it is, not as we want it to be. But yeah, I kind of facetiously say all films do it because films that cover it over, you know, there's often a returned repressed where there's something that doesn't sit right with us. So we can kind of think about our responses to certain kinds of films, but there are films that really expose the gaze of lack.
Citizen Kane being
Citizen Kane is a fantastic one, yeah.
because it kind of like all through there, you're looking for this object that is going to satisfy Rosebud, this wealthy person, is something that was kind of like was the answer to the lack, and then you kind of realize that it was just
trash. Basically, so yeah, this Citizen Kane, basically, it's on his deathbed, he's saying this word Rosebud, and this journalist, he's this really famous kind of industrialist, and is like so kind of like, what does this word mean? Anyway, he interviews all these people from Kane's life, and at the end of the film we're shown that it's actually the name that's on a sled from his childhood, and basically this word means so much to him. It's like the object that's been, it's the lost object, it's his object the thing that kind of keeps him going. But basically he was sent off to be raised by another man at the age of 8, and he was sledding in the garden when this guy turned up and his childhood ended. So Rosebud represents this magical world that was lost, but it's only magical because he lost it, and he's never going to be able to get it back. And so it tells us something about the way that we desire, and it sort of, in a manifest way, exposes very concretely, this is how we desire utopia, heaven, Eden is Eden insofar as it's lost.
Yes.
So, yeah, no, I do think these films that do it in a conscious way, they can really, and it's all to do with the way that we're kind of, like in a psychoanalytic session, our desire is speaking through the film. We are, in a position, we're sort of like, comforted in a sense because, like Freud's Fort Dar game, a lot of films sort of to do with expectation and genre, so you anticipate certain things and certain things are different. But this is all sort of like a comforting way that we're kind of able to be taken to a point where we can confront the horror of our desire, really, which is often it takes years in psychoanalysis to be able to accept because it's really traumatic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. That's brilliant. God, that's a great taster for a conversation we're going to have.
The thing is, like, when you think about it too much, you're like, does this make sense?
That's brilliant. And it's like, with this theory that we're exploring, and then bringing it down to Wizard of Oz and Citizen Kane, it's kind of like, this is the emancipatory potential of cinema, which we're going to explore, and also this is very intimately connected with psychoanalytic theory, but also the radical theology that I'm doing, that we're doing.
But so, I guess, the thing that I kind of feel quite passionately about is like a lot of, like everything eventually needs to be challenged. Everything is contradictory at a certain point. So when things, a certain take on psychoanalysis has lasted so long, and I think to do with the way it's gendered and how this is tied to contemporary progressive politics, which can often be, a bulwark against sometimes confrontation with, like, actually what is the undercurrent of capitalist economy. It's really important that these things are challenged, and it is surprising to me that, but I think it's maybe because I'm a filmmaker, and it's hard. It really is hard to articulate how much this theory has implicated on the way films are made and understood, especially in Europe, where there is, because of various economic policies, where Europe has basically become a corporate colony for American media organizations. So there's no real organic economy outside of state-run funding bodies who kind of have really adopted a certain perspective, which was absolutely correct a certain number of years ago. But capitalism is a fundamental dynamic, but the dynamic is one of desire. It's not a natural concrete system, but it's a system of desire that is always changing. And as Marx said, like, everything that is sacred is profaned, everything that is solid melts into air. Like, things are always changing, so we always need to think in new ways instead of sort of received wisdom, basically.
Yeah.